It's now my pleasure to introduce the professor who will be issuing our closing remarks, Fred Kaplan, who is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Queens College and Graduate Center, City University of New York. A biographer, literary scholar, and historian, he is the author, among other books, of biographies of Thomas Carlyle, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, Charles Dickens, Henry James, Gore Vidal, and Mark Twain. His Lincoln, the Biography of a Writer, a Lincoln Prize finalist, was published in 2008, and John Quincy Adams, American Visionary, in 2014. He is currently writing Lincoln Plain, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Civil War. A longtime resident of New York City, he now lives in Booth Bay, Maine. And those are two very different venues. Is Fred? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Off to my right. Would you join us?
I will.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you. I didn't even know who it was.
Yes, I now dwell in the Red Sox Nation. It is a nation of its own, but like all nations, it has its paranoia, it has its aggressiveness, it has its satisfactions, it has its territorial ambitions. I was born in the Bronx. I lived a great deal of my life in New York City. I'm very happy in Booth Bay, Maine. I was taken to my first baseball game when I was 10 years of age. My cousin lived in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the borderlands, you see, divided between the Red Sox Nation and the Yankee, what shall I say, the Yankee evil empire. Well, the Yankee empire is no more evil than the Red Sox Nation is evil. And by the way, on a day when the Red Sox have defeated the Yankees, I wear my Yankees baseball cap to all my local activities, so all my neighbors can be slightly commiserating, but mostly express happily their sense of superiority and condescension. When indeed the Yankees defeat the Red Sox in any given game, I, of course, wear my Red Sox cap in the interest of harmony, in the interest of peace, which isn't always easy to come by when nations are competing. We've had a lot of discussion today about competing nations, competing factions within nations, sub-nations, sub-sub-nations, and so on. Isn't that who we are, of course? Well, one comment before I begin what I hope will be my very brief concluding remarks, because one thing about something labeled concluding remarks is that they better be brief or nobody's going to be too happy with them. But one remark just in passing, because I am writing a book now about John Quincy Adams and Lincoln, bringing the two of them together in certain crucial ways, or certain what I think are significant ways. And one of my distinguished colleagues referred to the Black Hawk War of 1832. Abraham Lincoln, as a very young man, a resident in New Salem, Illinois at the time, proudly volunteered for the Illinois militia and fought in that war. He didn't actually see action, but he saw dead corpses. He saw corpses, he saw bodies. He proudly fought in that war, and he knew, as the Illinois militia knew, what that war was about. It was about property. It was about real estate. Property, 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 real estate, real estate, real estate. Equivalents of real estate are money and power. And that's what it's always been about. And that's where the violence comes from considerably, for we are a violent species when push comes to shove. And we protect our property because it belongs to us as a nation, and each of us individually. There's a deep primitiveness to it, but there's a deep biological and genetic ineradicability to it. So I don't think we should kid ourselves about this all that much. And though I too detest Andrew Jackson, and my question was really a historiographical question. What is it about us that allows us to feel so much superior to Jackson? And I do. You know, what is it about us that allows us to feel so superior to Jackson and to Calhoun and to all sorts of other people from the past? What a different version, a vision of property. And what hasn't been emphasized here today, of course, is that blacks, that Negroes, that slaves were considered property. And you could do what you liked with your property. You could buy it, you could sell it, you could abuse it, you could destroy it. It's no different from an old TV set, a picture tube TV set. Get rid of it. Get the flat screen better version. And get rid of that one too, if you like. It was property. To us, morally abhorrent. So why and how were those people so different from us? And more important, why are we so different from them? John Quincy Adams, who recently wrote a biography of, was president from 1825 to 1829. And his presidency was and is often judged to have been a failure, especially in comparison to a successful career as a diplomat and as Secretary of State. The Secretary of State who brought the country the benefits of the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was referred to, the 1819 to 1821 treaty, that expanded American property, territory, real estate, to Florida and a great deal of the Southwest. What is meant by the claim that his presidency was a failure is that very few of the public policies that he advocated were enacted into law. There has been, though, in my view, of course, not quite enough, reevaluation of Adams' presidency. That reevaluation calls for a sort of, different set of eyeglasses, a different perspective, because I somewhat, playing a little bit devil's advocate, but also with some deep sincerity, argue that in its own way, Adams's presidency was a success, especially in comparison to the presidency, the two-term presidency of the great warrior who succeeded him. It was a success in that it set a vision. It said, here's what I think the country ought to become. And it was a vision that was of an America bound together by federally supported infrastructure projects, by sound, modern, national monetary and banking systems, by a commitment to education, especially public education, the humanities, science, technology, and by racial and ethnic inclusiveness. Adams, early on, and this is part of his inheritance back to the founders of his own family, concluded that the black population of America, the slave population and the free blacks, we'll say roughly in 1830, 300,000 slaves and roughly 400,000 blacks were indeed Americans. And they were not in any other than the legal sense, property. He early on concluded that the black population of America was not only Americans with a genealogy as good, if not better if, in terms of how early the ancestors had come to America, than many white Americans. And that these blacks, both slave and free blacks, who in most states were not citizens, or were citizens in a very limited sense, deserved to be free Americans and eventually citizens. He rejected, which Lincoln did not reject and embraced almost until his dying days, the American Colonization Society, led by Henry Clay, a man I greatly admire in many ways, but who indeed was deeply racist and shared with most white Americans, even anti-slavery Whig moralists, the notion that, the belief that the United States was and is and always should be a white person's country. And the best solution to the slave problem and the free black problem was colonization. We should send them someplace else. We'd even be doing a favor. We could Christianize them, we could give them some support and money, and they could go to, say, Africa, Liberia, or some other alternatives, and have a country of their own. This vision, of course, was rejected by most of John Quincy Adams's contemporaries. But the insight that Adams had has become the reality of the America we live in. And though his vision in itself didn't make actual what he hoped for, it did become an anticipatory and clarifying model for those presidential administrations that made the progress that Adams failed to make. Well, until recently, as we've had lots of comments on today, the textbook version of Jackson's presidency that followed Adams is that it was a great success. He's a strong, take-charge president who expanded the power of the presidency, who provided us with the model of presidential power that the 20th century here in America, and the 21st up to a point, has mostly embraced. There has always been a lot of hesitation and doubt, especially in the 19th century, and especially in the anti-Jackson part of the United States, that presidents should be the kind of powerful chief executives that Jackson set the model for. But we've talked a lot about Jackson and slavery and Indians and so on, but in so many other ways, he was a disastrous president. I mean, his anti-manufacturing policies, a kind of return to a crude and reductive and anti-intellectual version of Jefferson's pastoralism, that is, the noble life was the life of the farmer, that American values really flourished where, I guess, someplace in the Midwest on a self-sustaining farm, that kind of thing, on and on. Well, sometimes we have been blessed with presidents who don't get their way. And in a certain sense, we can say that we were blessed with John Quincy Adams for many reasons, but not because he didn't get his way, but because eventually his way got us and we got his way. John Quincy Adams kept the country at peace. He upheld high and best national values. He attended capably to the business of executing the laws. As you know, the textbooks will tell you, he had a rough presidency because of the way in which he was elected by the House of Representatives, and was defeated by Jackson in November 1828. Well, in 1828, in one of the most difficult, scurrilous, and painful elections. There are so many of them, and we're experiencing one now. It's hardly, it's hardly really. It's so difficult to make comparisons about which one of our elections was worse than any other. The election of 1800, the election of 1828, a long list you can have. One of John Quincy Adams's virtues was a deep sincerity, a deep honesty, a deep transparency. He disguised things, he evaded things to himself, but he was a man of great feeling, of great compassion, and he was a man of tremendous practical common sense. What he was not was a good politician. And of course, all the positive things are very rare in a good, all the positive things I mentioned are very rare in a good politician. Tough, isn't it? To be honest, to be forthright, to be frank, to answer questions directly, to avoid sound bites and to be substantive, to not appeal to the worst in us, to not think that power and money and real estate are the best. And it's very hard because we all have that in us. And politicians, of course, live in that world. So maintaining some shred of the values that John Quincy Adams embodied is very, very difficult. And it almost certainly, alas, because this is about us in the broader sense, it almost certainly leads to, well, not certainly, I want to be more optimistic and end on an optimistic note. It in too many cases, leads to political defeat. This has been a wonderful opportunity for me to listen and to learn, and I thank these wonderful scholars, biographers whom I have learned from this morning. And as a biographer, what I urge on all historians is that you keep your fingers to the living pulse of history and to the dynamic and life-creating interaction between yourselves, your inner selves, who you are, and the history of our country. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much, Fred Kaplan. And now I want to thank everybody for attending this forum and for participating in it. And I want to remind people that half a dozen of the people who participated in a prominent way in this forum will be engaged in signing their books at the back of the room. There are half a dozen of them who will be signing their books. So I encourage all of you to take advantage of that as well. Again, thank you for attending.